Thank you so much, Rachel. I met Rachel, as she said, on the East Coast right when I had moved to Houston, totally overwhelmed by Whataburgers everywhere and lots of gas stations. And not only did she say, hey, I'm from Texas, I can help show you around, but she had a very unique way of pairing mathematical genius and facility with hard data with a love of Dostoevsky and Walker Percy and also like a huge heart for the hungry. And it's because of Rachel that I met Jimmy in Mission Waco. And it was at a time in my life when this had been 2013, 2014, 2015, life was rough. I kind of lost a lot of things at the deepest level of kind of family, some family relationships, sense of vocation was rather shaken up. And I found myself in a state that was huge, but also very embracing. And in that process, I was working for this offshoot of Laity Lodge called the Laity Lodge Leadership Initiative. And my task was to try to find institutions and communities that enable people to, what that prayer was, find the life that really is life. And I needed that as much personally as I was seeking to try to understand what that looked like in a world that seemed a society that seemed increasingly isolated. So in that period of time, I was talking to Rachel about sort of stories of communities that are really healthy, and she said, you should check out Mission Waco. And so I drove up here from Houston, met Jimmy in World Cup Cafe, and I'm drawn to organizations, frankly, that have a little trouble describing the magic sauce that makes them work. And Jimmy's very articulate, but I sensed there was this sort of organic whole that was bigger than the parts, that was kind of magnetic and captivating. So around that time, or fast forward maybe 6 to 9 months after I met Jimmy, I was contacted by this organization in DC that represented philanthropists and foundations from all across the country who were concerned that there had been a decline in what they called character building institutions. And would I maybe, with my kind of eye for, or my interest in the intangibles of community life, would I try to write a book and cast a vision for what a revival of, say, the Boy Scouts could look like in our day. And I have to say, maybe it's my gender and my generation, but I can't say that like reviving the Boy Scouts was what got me up every morning, although I've come to really respect and admire the Boy Scouts. But I was fascinated by this idea of, well, I am seeing, whether it's Mission Waco or Community Renewal or like millions of other organizations, big and small, that I'm seeing in Texas and beyond, there are like 1,000 lily pads of something really right happening in the U.S. that rarely gets covered. And if I could maybe tell those stories in a way that could help the donor community better understand what encourages human flourishing, then that just sounds like a project up my alley. So I began this work trying to figure out what does character formation look like in the 21st century. And I began with 4 assumptions, and truly, at least 3 out of the 4 of them were partially inspired by our conversation, Jimmy, that one time at World Cup Cafe. So they were, as I was just casting around the landscape, trying to find examples, they were affections matter, that we do just learn from those we love, from beauty, and in contexts where we feel an intense sense of belonging. So that was first. Second, just a wide variety of life experiences and observations made me convinced that no one social class or ethnic group has the corner on cultivating the golden soul. Each has its blind spots and each has its strengths. 3, honesty before suffering. Healthy communities and ecosystems hold people in times of great trial and confusion, loss, and uprooting. And once you know how to be held, you become better, hopefully, at holding others. Who is cultivating these wondrous fabrics of care? And then the 4th assumption I began with was that particular institutions and moral ecosystems have an embodied wisdom within them. They shape what we all take for granted, our habits, our desires, our assumptions, for good or ill. So I set out to find communities and or organizations that modeled these. And as I referenced, I kind of went everywhere. I went young and old, progressive, conservative, secular and faith-driven, urban, suburban, rural, super homogenous, super diverse, elite, marginalized, almost every professional sector. And I did this because my thinking was we're always being formed, actually, like every conversation at some even atomic small level, every school, church service, you might have a chance encounter with a neighbor. Anything has the chance to mold you a little bit. As you might imagine, this led to a Pacific Ocean of source material, which was overwhelming. So I just started asking people. This was like my go-to question. I hope it didn't make me a horrible dinner partner at parties, but I just would ask people, tell me, how is your own character shaped? And I asked custodial staffers this, and CEOs, and university presidents, and faculty, and 15-year-olds, gamut. And as I started hearing their stories, as they would just kind of reflect out loud on the various experiences of their lives, I began to notice this three-part pattern. They tended to mention a loving authority figure at an impressionable time of their lives, like a teacher, coach, grandmother. Second, they always recalled some difficult struggle or experience of struggle that forever after defined them, both in the scars it left and the spine it built. And third, they refer to a time when they became inspired to serve a context greater than themselves and committed themselves to that context with passion and commitment over a long period of time. So then I thought, okay, if this sort of three-part pattern is part of what happens when we're all being chiseled at our moral core, where are the ecosystems that are allowing this pattern to occur over and over? Where are the other mission Wacos? If it's true that we don't get formed by ourselves in a vacuum, but rather in a context and rings of context over a lifetime, what is the nature of those contexts that form people well in a positive direction? What characterizes those initiatives or institutions that mold us into the sort of people who are faithful spouses, responsible parents, generous neighbors, self-governing citizens, resolute in a crisis, and gracious at a picnic? If we can name, or if I could try to name the nature of these contexts, could maybe philanthropists or organizational leaders, thought leaders, and just everyday citizens perhaps play a wiser role in encouraging these contexts to unfurl in greater number? So I'm just going to tell you two relatively brief stories, and as I do, I want you to think about the following question in your own life. When you kind of cast through all the experiences you've had, what has been one of the healthiest institutions or beloved communities you've ever been a part of? And try to bring that to mind, and then try to think about what characterized it. What was it about it that left an enduring mark on you that has continued to this day? So these two snapshots are of particularly remarkable social and moral ecosystems that I found as I was doing this project. And the first one is about finding real heroes among some of the unlikeliest people imaginable. And the second is about the power of initiating intentional care, one neighbor at a time. So several years ago, we can go to the first slide, John. An acquaintance who lived in Utah, I met at a journalism gathering. He was telling me about this unusually wonderful moving experience he and his wife had just had. They had had a pretty bad move the previous time, and so they were on the hunt for a much more professional, much more trustworthy moving company. His wife was surfing Yelp, and she beckoned him over as she paused over 5 stars, a 5-star review placed. Look, she says, these guys are crazy. She kept scrolling down, it's all 5 stars, and all the praise is ubiquitous. They're called the Other Side Movers, and sure enough, every review commended exceptional integrity, swiftness, punctuality, and care. In an industry notorious for not always being the most helpful in one of the more dreaded logistical upheavals in a person's life or a household's life, the Other Side Movers were rated the #1 moving company in Utah, and they're still rated #1. And if you read a little closer, or as this couple read a little closer into the company tagline, it read, "Our students might have some wild tattoos, but they are the hardest working, friendliest, most polite, and the most careful movers you can find. We take care of you as though our lives depended on it. because they do. So it turns out that the Other Side movers were not your average moving crew. They hail from the Other Side Academy, which is a life training school for those with long criminal and addiction histories. Students commit here to a minimum of a 2-year residency, many of them having been arrested 25 times, and all of them having spent as much as 5, 10, and in a few cases 20 plus years in jail. It starts with the bench, an ordinary piece of furniture turned sacred. It sits in a crowded foyer in the back of this house in Salt Lake City. The bench is like a portal from the old life to the new one, if you will accept the truth and love, as they call it, that it takes to change your innermost core. There are 2 ways to become a member of the Other Side Academy. You can either walk in off the street or write a letter from jail. Most of the letters are desperate. They say things like, "I'm at rock bottom. I've realized I need to change, but I cannot do it on my own. Please help me. I promise I'm worth a shot." No one is ever turned down from an interview, but the process is rigorous. Only 10% of those who apply get admitted. The brutal honesty, that is the Other Side's hallmark, turns many away at the first encounter. "Do you love your family?" a woman I'll just call Jenny was asked during her first interview. She's now been a student at the Other Side for a little over a year. "Of course I do," she remembers responding. "No, you don't," came the reply. "You left them. You wouldn't be doing this crap to them if you loved them. I sure hate to see what you would do if you hated them." And Jenny, when she was recalling her first interview experience here, she still sucked in her breath, remembering the searing nature of this wake-up call to a more robust conception of what love actually is. The purpose of that first interview is to see if the person is willing to sit still and hear truth, often really hard truths, about their actions, their addictions, their motivations, behaviors, anything that has broken relationship with those around them. There's this social contract that's kind of established right in that first discussion that says, this is what whole person change is going to sound like for the next 2 years. Are you ready? This bench is once a birthplace and a grave. The idea is that life before the bench does not exist once you arrive, one of the students told me. Here, interestingly, past is prologue to the real living. If you go back to the past, to that image you had of yourself as the tough guy, to your bravado that left you swagger a jail identity around, to the logic that motivated you to escape responsibility and damage others, you get sent back to the bench for 6 hours, alone with your conscience, close to the door that could be your exit backwards. It's a kind of wooden purgatory as you stare at the wall and consider who you really want to be, all while staring at these 12 principles. These tenets permeate the Other Side Academy's way of life. They're on every wall. The model is entirely peer-to-peer and learn by doing. Everyone who sleeps overnight has spent time in jail. There's no one who, like me, has not spent time in jail, sleeping there overnight, overseeing things. There's no expert that swoops in saying, I'm going to fix you. Rather, it's, we're going to fix each other, and it doesn't matter how long it takes. Go to the next slide. This particular principle, 200% accountability, is what everything at the Academy hinges on, and it manifests specifically in a ritual they call games. Games is a twice-weekly circle. You might think of it, if any of you are churchgoers, like a really intense small group on steroids, where they meet twice a week and the wrongs of the week get broken down and addressed to the offender's face. If a rule of the house is broken, say, in their case, a woman speaks to a man at the wrong hour, they have pretty strict rules around gender separation here, another female student will pull up the offending student and say, hey, we don't do that here. That's an example of a confrontation. Then the correcting student will draw a slip, put it in the games drawer, and come Tuesday or Friday surround the offender with a tidal wave of feedback. It gets colorful really quickly. Oftentimes, you're not even aware you're doing something wrong, but we are telling you, this woman Jenny told me. We'll say, hey, Susie, that's not appropriate. And then other people will start jumping on that indictment, saying, hey, come on, you're a leader. In this house, you know better. Get it together. It's a culture shock for every newcomer, especially those coming out of the prison ethos of no snitching. The last thing you ever do in jail is give feedback, Jenny told me. But here, if I care about you, I will give you feedback. After society has given up on them, to say nothing of prison wardens, there's a shock of a call here to do better, and a communal structure that is patient with you as you try. Many students often struggle to accept the love that's on the other side of the truth coin. Running the streets for as long as many of them have, they actually don't know what it's like to be cared for holistically. Here, every student experiences both the giving and the receiving of exhortation and discipline. When they're working together, cleaning together, cooking, explicitly scrutinizing one another, it's like a familial gem tumbler that just doesn't stop. The other side of Academy is completely self-supporting. The students run the program which generates yearly income for the Academy at large. And then they've started businesses. The first company was the Other Side Movers, which teaches everything from showing up on time to packing cleanly to sweeping the floor and to eventually running the office side of the company. Last year, they started a thrift boutique. When they move, many of the affluent households served by the Other Side Movers end up with clothing, furniture, dishes, and other items they'd like to donate. They have this jingle on their moving cards that says, "Let us come into your home and move your valuables. We've done it through the window before. This time it'll be through the door." Next slide, thank you. Students have also started a construction company and a landscaping firm, culinary services, and a body shop. Some of the students sit in the basement for 8 hours, making corporate development calls and sharing about the Academy's work and mission. It's really not the particular skills of any one craft that the Academy is trying to develop. They're really more concerned that you learn how to get up every day, go to work, have a good attitude, do as you're asked, learn how to learn, go to bed, and do it all again the next day. It's through the daily doing of the work and honoring customers' needs that students learn virtues that jail never taught them. Go to the next slide. So you can press play and click again. This is an example of just two guys helping each other put on a tie. Of all the people who have entered the Other Side Academy in its first 3 years of existence, 75% have graduated in 2 years. Of those who have graduated, all are now employed and nobody has reoffended. After 2 years of hard work, brutal honesty, communal living, and gradual transformation, these students get to graduation, a much vaunted day. Like everything else at the Academy, there's a monument marking the transition. In this case, not a bench, but a bridge that extends from the front door to the rest of their lives. When students are first admitted to the program, they're brought to this same side of campus, where at the foot of the bridge, they make solemn promises to join the community and accept help for a new life. Graduation marks a return to this bridge with a walk back out to the watching world. Ceremony, students read letters aloud to each other, graduates to the students and vice versa, graduates to their families, many of whom have experienced years, if not decades, of disappointment with their child until this moment. And you see a lot of different emotion rippling through the faces, so I got to attend one of these, and here's what I heard. "Scotty O, you have been a rock for me over the last 18 months, says one of the current students to that day's graduate. There have been times here where I felt unimportant, lost, anxious, and misunderstood. Times when I needed clarity with certain crucial topics about family, love, connection, disordered thoughts, you name it, and you've always been there for me, always. Never once have you been at a loss for just the right words to cut to my soul and help my paradigm shift. You are authentic, talented, and beautiful. I love you, and I know that you love me. Your actions have shown it. Now, true to what we do here, I will pass on this gift of love and understanding to others." It was a very strange thing for me to watch men with pockmarked faces and shaved heads speak in such open emotion to one another. You could see some of the watching students like contorting their facial muscles. They were either too moved to show their own emotion publicly, or maybe daunted by the path between now and their future selves, seeing in the graduates the hard road that it would take to get to that countenance they were now seeing. And then Scotty, the graduate that I saw that day, he spoke. He said, "Right before I came here, I found myself yet again in that same direction where everything in my life was crumbling, and I was ruining lives and hurting people and doing a lot of horrible things. I really was tired of doing all of that, but I didn't know what else to do. I really didn't feel like I deserved to see the world. I just wanted to die. I had already done 14 years of my life incarcerated, and I didn't want to keep doing it. So I wrote a letter after someone told me about this place. All I figured what it was better than going to prison and better than dying. So I got here and I thought, this is the weirdest place ever. These people are nuts. All the staff members were nice and friendly, and then every once in a while they were really mean. It drove me crazy when I got here. And then I realized that it was my thoughts that were crazy. I had such a backward mentality about what the good was, about what self-respect was, and where it should be rooted. I really didn't get it. The humility was really breathtaking. And then he continued, after being here for 2 years, I think the biggest thing I've learned is that it's not all about me. It's about the next guy and the newest guy. It's about finding somebody who needs help and helping them. And that's the only way that I get better. I learned that from Lola and Dave and all the staff here. It seems like they consistently are always trying to help the next person, and they showed me that so many times. You know, from the small things, like seeing somebody stuck in the snow on the side of the road and just stopping whatever we were doing as a house and jumping up and helping them. And then he looked at his family in this moment and kind of swallowed and said, like I did back when I was a little kid. So as the 71 students and their families surround the one graduating, there's one person who has already graduated standing on the other side of the bridge to welcome them. The new graduate will cross, say a final liturgy that reflects on the honest terrain of the state that he or she was in when they entered the academy, how they traveled through it, and where they are now. And then they just make this promise. They say, I promise to spend the rest of my life saving and serving others, just as you have saved and served me. Will you help me now as I do my best to live our beliefs on the other side? And the staff and other graduates say, yes, you may now cross over. You can just click through. So these are some before and after photos. So freshman to senior. That's the whole school. So human transformation is just always, these are really dramatic examples, but, I think shocking and captivating. And in this case, some of them probably have experienced some kind of a religious conversion, but it was more through in the classical sense or traditional sense, but it was more through encounter with one another and these norms that have seeped through this community that they are now bringing into their free lives. And it was at this place, somewhat unexpectedly for me, that I was dramatically jolted into a much higher vision of what it means to be a person of character, but also, and perhaps more importantly, what it looks like to embody and belong to a whole community of character. Here in real life, real practice, were 100 men and women having spent years, if not decades, in a hellhole that the average citizen probably disdains, now teaching me with their lives that had grown not just to appreciate, but to love the good. And they were graced by humility, honesty, eye contact, conscientiousness, courage in choosing the right, a whole bunch of things. And I just found myself more morally humble than I'd ever been in my life. But they didn't just give me a picture of what good character looks like, but some fresh clues as to what great character might require. What it requires in the present in any of our lives in terms of having a healthy communal bed beneath us and before us, beckoning our better angels to be the dominant personality operating in the world, but also what it requires in the pathway that forms the sorts of people I think most of us want to be, and we certainly want to know. People who are devoted teachers, faithful husbands, present and generous neighbors, selfless mothers, tireless and kind custodial staffers, responsible journalists, persevering students, resilient soldiers, wise CEOs, prudent public servants. How do you cultivate a community of character that nurtures all of this in the multi-context world most of us want to live in? And so this question just leads me to a second story, which I'll tell very briefly. This is Miss Rosie. And in 1970, Rosie moved to Shreveport from Bastrop, Louisiana. She was looking for a neighborhood with good schools and churches, and she specifically wanted, in her words, a rural philosophy, where people could pretty much know each other and look out for each other, and your children will do what I tell them to do, and my children will do what you tell them to do. She found what she was looking for in a working-class Black neighborhood in Shreveport called Allendale. At the time, Allendale had a mix of homes, businesses, restaurants, and congregations. Tina Turner and James Brown had graced its music halls. And for the first 15 years of her life there, even with the upheaval of the civil rights movement riling the South, Allendale was exactly what she'd hoped for. Students went to school, adults went to work, and families went to church, she told me. Children played with each other. We could leave our doors unlocked. It was great. But by the 80s, many of the children who'd grown up in Allendale were going off to college or the military and moving to the suburbs. Homeowners began to rent out their properties, and in her words, the people who came in to rent, they just didn't have the same philosophy that the ones had when I first came. They came with a different point of view. So Allendale began to slide. At first, it was just a messy house here, an act of unneighborliness there. But soon people started to avert their eyes on the street, locking their doors and hunkering down as one block sprouted 6 crack houses and gunshots became routine. An interstate was built that cut off the neighborhood from the rest of Shreveport, and before long, Allendale was, in Miss Rosie's words, pitiful. I actually felt ashamed to see something so beautiful go down so quick. The deterioration of the neighborhood led to a deterioration of behavior. In the healthy Allendale, there had been a moral ecology that nurtured traits like trust, self-discipline, and neighborly care. But that ecology got pushed aside. Marriage rates plummeted, children grew up without dads or loving attachment from neighbors and extended family. As isolation increased, so did drug use and the murder rate. In 1991, there were 80 homicides in this neighborhood alone, almost 2 killings per week. And before long, every single business had closed or moved away. Residents saw very little future for themselves. Meanwhile, the larger city of Shreveport seemed disinterested. Legally, segregation was over, but white folks were not touching the city's Black neighborhoods. An ethos of privacy and gated communities crept in. Wealthier kids traded Little League for private travel teams and cultural exposures far away. Adults lost touch with their neighbors. Public playing fields and parks just totally growing fallow. This guy, a man named Mac McCarter, saw all of this and he just couldn't handle it. He was a Shreveport native and a proud alum of the local high school there. He'd gone off to become a civil rights activist in the late 60s, then headed to Texas, actually, for seminary and the pastorate out in Hereford, which I think is pretty far west Texas. He returned to Shreveport in 1991 and was shocked by how bad things had gotten. A reader of historian Arnold Toynbee, Mac realized he wasn't just seeing a city in a tailspin, he was seeing a whole culture decline. It kept him up at night, but he refused to accept that doom was inevitable and just knew he had to do something to stem the tide of dysfunction. If society is fundamentally relational, Mac told me, then from what I learned from thousands of hours of pastoral counseling, society could be healed. Decades of walking alongside people struggling with broken marriages, abuse, family dysfunction, and loneliness convinced Mac that relationships have rules that, in his words, are just as ineluctable as the laws of gravity. So he wrote up some of his observations. He said, hey, relationships work over the long haul when you seek the other person's good as much as you seek your own. Other people are treasured for their own sake, never used as a means. You choose to forgive all wounds to the mind, emotions, or spirit, whether slight or serious. You confess your own wounding actions and seek forgiveness. You give the other person attention with the intention always to deepen and sustain the relationship. Max stared at these rules and wondered what it would look like if they were shared through coaching and applied to whole cities. He had a suspicion that most anti-poverty and social improvement efforts were undermined by a failure to build the healthy relationships they required. Relationships that were a necessary foundation for things like safety, good neighboring, motivated workers. His formula was build community first, teach the skills of caring, and walk the talk with simple acts. Once the power of intentional relationship hits people, he hypothesized, communities can then move to higher levels of well-being. So we set to test this in Allendale. historically black neighborhood, which had by then become the poorest and most dangerous neighborhood in the city. Every Saturday morning, he would drive over there, walk the blocks for weeks at a time. No one came out to see him. He saw little kids' eyes from the porches staring in suspicion. But gradually, some months in, kids started coming out, and he was just very lovable and warm and self-deprecating and full of humor and very tall. And it was kind of like a Pied Piper parade. And he and his wife joined the Black Baptist Church in the neighborhood. They were the two white faces in the pews, and gradually some trust started to build over time. There was something about his speaking that sounded sincere, Miss Rosie recalls, after first not trusting him. After 2 years of consistent presence there, he created a training workshop for people interested in building stronger relationships with their neighbors, and this started trickling to all the other neighborhoods in the city. I don't have time to go into all the details of what this is. It's essentially a reincarnation of Jane Addams' settlement house movement, if some of you are familiar with that. But basically, every block has kind of a block leader that leads things for the block. There's just an intentional, relational network with activities and a sense of people know what's going on all across the city. This has led to massive decreases in crime. People who had moved away have returned. And while imperfect, the city is really a model that it's possible to rebuild social capital from the inside out. There's a membership that people take as part of being a resident in Shreveport. You fill out a card simply called the We Care card, and you write down one thing you're doing for someone else. It could be taking communion to a disabled person. It could be just picking up the newspaper on your neighbor's house. You write it down, and then you have a sign on your car in front of your yard and a pin on your lapel that just says We Care. And now, in a city of 300,000, 54,500 people consider themselves part of the We Care movement. So I tell you these two stories, which are quite different, but are both just examples of human transformation in the context of community, just to show you a little bit of some of what I discovered that I think is happening out there in a lot of different ways, often very particular to context. And just to wrap up, one of the things I've tried to do is figure out what is going on, what are the norms at play in these either closed organizations or, in this case, whole cities, where people's better angels are inspired to come out as citizens, as friends, as leaders of organizations. And I came up with too long of a list, and all the pastors in the room will get mad at me because it's 16, and I'm not going to read them all, but 16 norms that are in place. It's not a 3-point sermon, unfortunately. I've tried. But I'll just mention a few of them. And in this little book that I wrote, I frame it in the form of questions. Like, these are questions you can ask if you're trying to understand how healthy your organization, town, institution are. And I think they can transcend, they're sort of first principle enough, and they're intrinsic enough that they hopefully transcend different sectors. So I'll just read a few of them so you have a flavor. Telos, does the organization have a clear, strong reason for being in the world, embraced and pursued by all of its members? Does it give its members organizing criteria for what to love? 2, liturgies and rituals. Is there a covenant or creed that is affirmed regularly as a community, in word and deed? Are there communal rhythms, routines, and rituals? Full engagement by all members. Are all members of the organization, regardless of position or stature, engaged in the mission and aware of the significance and contribution of their roles? Whole person. Does the organization have a clear conception of the whole person, head, heart, and helping hand, and seek to develop it? My favorite one is joy. These are just like signals that something right is going on. Joy. Is there joy in the house? Are hospitality and unconditional welcome a key part of the institution's DNA? And then the last one I'll read, I call it generativity. When people depart from this formative institution, do they promote a similar culture in other contexts? Has it imparted a set of ideals that members want to live up to ever after? And there's about 12 more, which I won't read here, but if you're interested, I have little sheets, and I'm happy to hand that to you. It's not so much a how-to manual, but maybe a guide to some ideals that might reinvigorate our communal or institutional vocabulary so we can figure out how to make, I think, a lot of the spheres where we have influence a little more inspiring of our echoing our echoing selves. And I'll just finish something that Max says often. He says, caring alone cannot heal our nation, but caring together can.